produces more Oromo refugees now than ever before. There are more Oromo living outside of Ethiopia than ever before. It produces as many UNHCR recognised refugees as does Iran, 68,000 in 2010, and it's second only to Colombia in terms of being the origin of the largest number of asylum seekers at the end of 2010. These are figures from UNHCR. In November and December last year, I visited Djibouti and Hargeisa in Somaliland. I interviewed refugees in Djibouti city, just on the south here of the Gulf of Tajura, and at Ali Adi refugee camp, which is about 120 kilometres towards the Ethiopian border there. And then I flew from Djibouti to Hargeisa, where I interviewed refugees as well. This is Djibouti city. It has only about 1,800 recognised refugees and asylum seekers from Ethiopia. It's got a lot more from Somalia. They're mainly asylum seekers because the decision-making process is very slow in Djibouti. There are very few actual refugees, unless they're Somali refugees, which get prima facie refugee status. The refugees themselves estimated that there were 6,000 Amharas and about 5,000 Oromo in the city. Most live in Somali Isa-style huts or in shacks, as you saw on the previous slide. Shacks like this. Most of them are in shacks like that. This is Rare. He was one of the refugees I interviewed in Djibouti. Overall, there were 43 interviewees on this trip. Mohammed, you need to turn your phone off. This is Rari. He's a 35-year-old from Weta. He said in 1991, they said everyone has the right to support the party they want. He witnessed the massacre of Weta after the 1992 elections and was quite sure of the number of people killed. His father, in his late 40s, and his brother, aged about 20, he was about 17 at the time, were amongst 1,000 demonstrators he said were shot dead. He said there were about between 150 and 200 soldiers, and half of them were firing for about 20 or 30 minutes, picking off as many as they could and picking off people who were trying to leave the place where they were demonstrating. He was in tears when he was talking about this event. He said the bodies were piled so deep I was only able to find my brother because he had deformed toes and his feet were sticking out of the pile of bodies. Asli is 33, all these names are false by the way. Asli is a 33-year-old from Kambolcha. She and her husband were quite well off. He was a vegetable merchant and they owned a couple of cows and 4 oxen. Her husband was taken away by 4 soldiers in 2007 and disappeared in detention. A month later she was taken to an unofficial detention centre where she was interrogated and beaten every day, and after being beaten into semi-consciousness she was raped by 2 usually different soldiers each night, by about 20 soldiers in all, she estimated. This continued for about 3 weeks until she collapsed and was taken to hospital, where a nurse helped her escape. She walked 25 kilometres to see her 2 children, 7 and 9, left them with relatives, and then she walked 2 days to get to Djibouti. She was pregnant from being raped and delivered in hospital in Djibouti, and now she lives in poverty with 6 other women and 5 children, getting by washing clothes. Ali Adi camp is in a beautiful desert region of Djibouti. This is Ali Adi camp, and that's the town of Ali Adi. It's also got a military garrison from the old days of the French Foreign Legion. There's about 18,000 refugees in the camp, mostly Somalis, prima facie refugees. And it's a tented camp, unlike the camps in Kenya. And this is the Ethiopian block. Does anybody remember the singer, the Oromo singer, Kadir Said? Yeah? That's him. We thought he was going to be reformed a few years ago, but in fact he is alive and well and living in Ali Adi. This is Khadija. She's a 34-year-old from the Amhara Muslim minority in Wollo. Her father and brother ran off to support the Ethiopian Patriotic Front in 1991. And 2 soldiers took away her mother, who disappeared in detention. She was 14 years old at the time. Another soldier stayed behind, threatened her with a pistol, and despite the fact that she was only 14, he raped her in the house. Her husband is virtually enslaved by a Djibouti gendarme. He works in the chap's shop in the city and for a pittance, and he's only allowed back to the camp for a few days every 4 or 5 months. She was a cook at the military post but was sexually harassed by a soldier there, and he still comes to Ali Adi camp threatening her with arrest when she refuses to have sex with him. This is Osman. He's a 41-year-old, 41-year-old. He was an arable farmer who supported the OLF when they were legal, 91 to 92. He said, a week after the election, and when the OLF had left the country, Tigrayan soldiers came to my brother's home. They immediately shot my brother dead in front of me and took me to Masala military camp. He was held in a room 3 meters by 3 meters with 31 others for 4 months. They said the guards had to push them like Japanese rail people do to get them on the rush hour trains in Tokyo. The guards had to push them to get them all into the cell at night. He said the only way of sleeping was if everybody turned at the same time in the cell. So the shout would go up, turn now, and everybody would turn over. I heard this a couple of times. About 5 times a week he was taken out at night, beaten and subject to mock execution, firing a rifle near to his head. His teeth were damaged where they stuck a Kalashnikov barrel actually into his mouth. And with his hands tied behind him, he was pushed into a hole in the ground and they fired the rifle near to him. On 3 or 4 days each week, he said, they took us to a narrow room and ran water from a pipe over my head, so it was difficult to breathe and I thought I was drowning. Meanwhile, they were beating my back everywhere with electric cable. It is a very cold place. This continued for 3 or 4 hours. On one occasion, he fell outside of the torture room on his way back to his cell where he was being held. And he said they got a glowing red-hot iron pipe and put it on my stomach, and that's the scar from the burning. Now, there was a man called Jundi Baka who was snatched by an Ethiopian and Djibouti security squad in December 2010 with a few others. There were 9 in all. I think I mentioned this yesterday. And he said he was staying in Djibouti at the time. He said 15 days after Jundi was taken in Djibouti, this was December 2010, I was staying with a family there. I'd been with them for 2 days and was out in town early morning when Ethiopian security men came to the house and asked for me by name. They were in an Ethiopian embassy car with Djibouti security forces. The man who lived there, a distant relative, said I was not with them. They took him, according to his wife. People don't know what happened to him. I came straight back to Ali Adi. Like many of the men there, he reported sleeping outside of the camp at night, fearing being snatched by squads of Ethiopian and Djibouti forces. This is Amina. She's a 30-year-old from near Chiro, West Haragi. In 1993, after fighting between Oromo and Amhara in her area, soldiers came to a family home and took away her father, who was a former Derg officer, and her mother, 2 brothers and 1 sister. That's virtually the whole family. She's not seen them since. She was only 11 or 12 years old. 2 soldiers took her separately and raped her. She said, "They beat me and injured me, raping me all night until I passed out." They abandoned her in the forest, where she was found by strangers from a nearby village next day, who looked after her for about 6 months. They took her back to her home after this 6 months' time, and she said, "It was burnt down, our cows and goats had disappeared. Neighbours said my older brothers had run away from the EPRDF, and that there was no news of my father or the rest of my family." This is Fatia. She's a 30-year-old Amhara from Diridawa. She ran a successful restaurant in Diridawa, where people used to come and chat. Just after the 2005 elections, a group of soldiers in an army pickup came to the restaurant and rounded up the 8 or 9 customers, including her brother. They beat them and accused them of being CUD supporters. Fatia escaped, but the government closed her restaurant. Her brother was a student and he wasn't a CUD supporter. Nevertheless, neighbours told her that he was taken to hospital after being severely beaten and died there. She left her 9-month-old son with her mother and hid near Diridawa for 15 days before travelling by car to the border with Djibouti, when she walked to a place called Dikil, from where she went to the camp. In Djibouti, she worked for 5 years as a maid in a house in the Plateau district, which is northeast part of Djibouti city. In May 2010, she was stopped by a big man, a Somali, while she was walking to catch a bus home. He raped her in a dark place on the street, she said. When she was heavily pregnant from this rape, she was stopped on the street by 3 Somali speakers anyway. She handed over the money that she was carrying, but they beat her nonetheless and stabbed her on her left arm, left shoulder and breast, and cut her across the tip of the nose, and raped her, she said, not in the proper way, injuring her right buttock with a big stone. UNHCR took her to a hospital where she was kept for 25 days. She later delivered her baby on the street and was cared for by Djibouti people. When the baby was 3 months old, she was moved to Ali Adi camp. 1 week before the interview, she'd been beaten by a Somali man near the water pipe at the camp. She banged her head on a stone and she was admitted to the clinic there for 3 days. Her husband sleeps outside of the camp, fearful of being taken by Ethiopian and Djibouti security forces. I flew from Djibouti to Hargeisa just for 3 or 4 days, halfway through the trip, and interviewed, I think it was 17 people in Hargeisa. Almost everybody had used this route to get to Hargeisa. Jijiga, Wachale, the border town of Wachale, and then either walked or got trucks or whatever to Hargeisa. Hargeisa is more spread out than Djibouti city. Most of the refugees in Hargeisa live in huts like this, Isa Somali style huts. This is the social welfare centre where refugees used to get some help from Save the Children Fund, funded by UNHCR. They used to have access to education and supplementary feeding and limited medical care. That's the outside of the social welfare centre. At the beginning of 2011, UNHCR had been paying families between $40 and $80 a month to help them subsist in the city. They were accused of by the Somaliland authorities of attracting refugees into Somaliland by paying this allowance. And so they stopped it for the majority of 540 or so families that were receiving it. Because of that, people fell behind with their rents. In September, the Somaliland government made it illegal to employ illegal immigrants. But the local population didn't distinguish between illegal immigrants, people who were registered as asylum seekers, or people who had refugee status, which is very few. And so basically everybody was sacked from the menial jobs that they were doing. And so they failed to pay their rent. They were kicked out by their landlords. It was also made illegal to rent property to illegal immigrants. And so they were left destitute with nowhere to go. And about, well, between 200 and 270 started to camp within the social welfare centre, and another 200 to 250 camped over the road. These were mainly asylum seekers. The ones inside the centre tended to be recognised refugees. These are inside the centre there. And this is outside. Remember this picture. You'll see another picture later on of the same area. This was a picture drawn by a man who I interviewed. He used to be an OLF member. He was at a market near Jijiga in December 1999 when he was arrested, taken to a military camp and tortured horribly. He was tortured. This was new to me. His description of what happened. He was kept in a very tiny cage, and they subjected him to electric shocks from a metal plate on which he had to squat inside this cage. And he said when they put the electricity into the plate, his body was flung against the sides and the roof of this cage. I'd never heard of that before. Time is getting on, so I won't go through the rest of his horrendous history. This is a 48-year-old chap who was a pharmacist who worked for the Aroma Relief Association until it was closed in 1995. His pharmacy was confiscated. He decided to join the OLF, and he was attending a field hospital of the OLF in 1998 when they surrounded it, the TPLF, and two of his friends ran off. They were shot dead. He put his hands up, and these are the bullet wounds in his arm where he was shot through his arm. He had horrendous genital torture applied to him using an instrument they used to castrate bulls. And within 24 hours he not only had that hot plastic dripped over his genitals and groin, but he also had his leg broken, and they tied a rope around his waist and dumped him into a river so he was above his head, so he was drowning, and then they pulled him out again and dumped him back and so on. This is a 32-year-old lady who was refueled from Djibouti in 1996. Remember, I'm interviewing now in Hargeisa. She was sent back from Djibouti. She was held in the old cotton factory in Niradara. They took 13 of them out to a ravine from Kotoni, the old cotton factory. They shot them. These were people that they'd taken back from Djibouti. 12 of them were killed, and she was injured in her abdomen and the left thigh, which is what this bullet was. I couldn't continue the interview with her, unfortunately, because place we were doing the interviews in Hargeisa was attracting too much attention, and it got to be a bit dangerous. This is Asiya, 25-year-old lady. Her husband was taken in 2004. They came back to the house. Soldiers came about midnight, kicked down the door when she refused to open it, and they made her walk, holding her 13-month-old baby at gunpoint, to a military camp, which is normally a 1 or 2 hour walk from her home. And the 4 soldiers raped her by the side of the road there on the journey. She was held in the camp for 25 days, and every night when there was a change of guard, she was called from her cell. She was knocked down, kicked with military boots in her back, and raped. She was raped once or twice every night. She estimates that she was raped by 12 or 15 soldiers in the camp. Mohammed kindly presented findings from 58 interviews in Kenya in 2010 at last year's OSA conference in July. Combining those 58 interviewees with the 43 interviewees from Djibouti and Hargeisa, there were 101. Out of these 101 interviewees, 48% had been tortured. Most studies of refugee populations quote between 5 and 35% as the number of the percentage of refugees that have a history of being tortured. The only figure that's as high as this is from Minneapolis, research done by people from the Minnesota Center for Victims of Torture and the University of Minneapolis amongst Oromo and Somali refugees, where they get similar figures. 69% for men, 35% for women. If you look at just the detainees, 75% of detainees are tortured. If you look at the male detainees, 88% of male detainees are tortured in Ethiopia. Rape, there were 50 women interviewed. At least 17 have been raped. There was one in Kenya whose face changed when she was talking about detention, but she refused to go on because her husband was there. There was another 1 or 2 who it wasn't possible to ask about the conditions of detention. So 17 is a conservative number. Out of female detainees, 12 plus out of 21 were raped, and 5 more were raped by soldiers at or near their home. What refugees fear most is being refoulement, being sent back to Ethiopia. This is a 39-year-old Ogadeni lady. Have I got 10 minutes left? That's brilliant, thank you. Okay.
Okay, I'll reduce it to 5.
This is a 39-year-old Ogadeni lady whose cousin was abducted in Djibouti City in January 2010. These are old placards that they held up at demonstrations, by the way, when visiting delegates from embassies and whatnot came to Ali Adi camp. This is the community building where I did most of the refugee, most of the interviews in Ali Adi. Her cousin is the lower one of these two. Well, no, they're both cousins. This is the one that was taken in Djibouti City in January 2011. And that's his brother, who stays at the camp, but ever since this fellow was taken, he sleeps outside the camp. This is back in Hargeisa. This is the daughter and granddaughter of a man called Abdi Shukur Mohammed Usman, a 43-year-old registered asylum seeker who was abducted in Hargeisa and sent back to Ethiopia on the 10th of November last year, 3 weeks before my visit. This is the family of Abdurrahman Mohammed Kabato, a 55-year-old, taken by a Somaliland Ethiopian snatch squad in the early hours of 26th of October 2011, 1 month before my arrival. I think she belongs to the same family, but I'm not sure. That was a photograph that was sent to me, not one that I took. I took this one. This is the sister of Yasin Adam Ahmed, a young Oromo recognised refugee. He was detained and reportedly tortured in February 2010 and recalled 3 days later. Now, the Somaliland government claims that the destitute refugees and asylum seekers in Hargeisa are economic migrants. How often do we hear this from immigration authorities all over the world, eh? And here they are holding up their papers, showing that they are registered asylum seekers with UNHCR. The International Organization for Migration is basically paid for by governments throughout the world who don't want to accept refugees, so they pay money into the International Organization for Migration to organize the process for them and to keep out as many as possible. This is the Migration Response Center from the Interior Ministry in Hargeisa, and their main response to refugees is to try and get them back into Ethiopia. And they had persuaded several hundred to do so. I'm not saying that all the people in Hargeisa from Ethiopia are fleeing human rights abuse. What I would say is that at least 90% of them. On the 22nd of December, yeah, Mohammed, can you help me get back to that one and show?
It's just great.
Okay, these are people being transported, refugees and asylum seekers being transported after a meeting with the Interior Ministry on the 22nd of December. They're being transported into detention in Hargeisa, from where they sent them 8 days later, no, 6 days later, on the 28th of December, to the border with Ethiopia, where they tried to get them sent back. The reason the Interior Ministry did this was that they had refused to move from the social welfare centre. They said, we can't go anywhere, we don't have money, we can't rent, people are beating us up if we walk around town, what are we meant to live on? And the Interior Ministry, instead of discussing the situation with them, with the help of UNHCR, just bundled up these 22 people, included 2 breastfeeding women, so 20 adults and 2 babies, bundled them into 2 trucks, put them in detention, and then sent them to the border 6 days later. Fortunately, the International Committee of the Red Cross intervened and persuaded the security officers who were sending them over the border to the Ethiopian side to just let them go in the no man's land between the border. And that's quite a busy area, there's a lot of trading going on. And they were able to just slip back into Somaliland. Eventually they got into Djibouti, most of them. 2 of them, we don't know what happened to them. But the others are now in Ali Adi camp, thank God. Destitute, short of food the refugees were no longer in receipt of the support from UNHCR. Save the Children shut down the help at the Social Welfare Centre because these people were protesting there, and consequently you've got kids with severe malnutrition. These youngsters got kwashiorkor, protein calorie malnutrition. This one's got marasmus, which is malnutrition, which is throughout the nutrition spectrum, it isn't specifically protein. That. Since November, 13 kids died at the Social Welfare Centre, and 3 adults have died. So the children being buried. And on the 7th of April, 7th of March, just 1 month ago, they took a bulldozer. Remember, I asked you to remember what that place looked like on the other side of the road, the Social Welfare Centre. This is where the asylum seekers were camped. The municipal authorities took a bulldozer to it and said, get out, basically. Since then we've been in fairly hectic correspondence with UNHCR, and the allowances have been resumed for most of the refugees. They're still in a lot of problems there, and I'm still getting emails about people dying and having difficulty accessing help within Hargeisa. Ethiopia, whose government is at the roost of all this death, disease and misery, receives more aid than any other country in the world, except for Iraq, Afghanistan and Indonesia. 3 billion in 2011. It's the biggest recipient of UK aid. It has a large and well-equipped army, and more families reliant on food aid than ever before, despite over 20 years of aid. It's contributing to regional instability. Somalia now has Al-Shabaab and is a recruiting ground for Al-Qaeda, thanks to the Ethiopian invasion at the end of 2006. Okay. Not all doom and gloom. This is Kakuma camp in Kenya, where the Aroma Relief Association has set up microfinance projects for women with sewing machines and this sort of thing. This is since the visit in September 2010, and computer training for youngsters there. And other groups within the camp all come to the Aroma block to do this computer training, which is self-funded by just enough to pay for the fuel for the generator for the computer. And since I've been talking about the trip to Kenya, I've been collecting money from audiences like you, and we've managed to get 4 girls, these 3 and this young lady, into secondary schools in Nairobi. The only way out for these kids is education. So, and it does cost a fair bit. It's about $250 per individual per year, and it's a 4-year secondary education. But I shall be passing the box round in a minute, and I shall want people to put dollars into it, and I'll promise you that it will go to the 2nd year of these young ladies' education in Nairobi. That's about it, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Truman, as always. As you can see, following, listening to Dr. Truman and watching his videos and what pictures he captures while traveling to all these places, it's self-torturous, really, for audiences. And so you can imagine what people who are living every day are going through in those places. and thank you so much for documenting that and for that bringing that to the attention of people like here and elsewhere as well, wherever you go and show this. Thank you on behalf of those people. Again, as I said, we need, in our own fair way, to share if we can contribute a little bit to help that. And there was a happy ending at the end where we can make a difference.
Don't be fooled by the rhetoric of Western governments respecting human rights and respecting refugees. They only do so because they're held to account by people like you and me and your communications business that you've got with O'Brien. And that's why those things are essential to hold our governments to account. And it's only by doing that that they will observe any sort of human rights. So that's your question. Yes. Great.
Okay, I'm going to make that the last one and then we're going to continue.
Yeah, sorry.
I think the stories that you tell about the rape is really horrific and appalling, obviously. And my question is, in terms of the identity of the perpetrators of the acts of rape, who are these people who are raping? And then also, when they're raping these women, what do they say to them? In terms of slur and stuff.
I've heard of from several women that they've been told this is because you've hidden somebody, this is because your husband supports the OLF, this is or supports one of the other opposition groups. Remember, some of these ladies were Amharas. And I've heard one or two report being told, we're going to do this every night until you tell us where your husband is, or where your brother is, or where your father is, this sort of thing. So it is used as a direct tool of torture. But in addition to that, it's just part of the general level of abuse and denigration of the people that they're dealing with. Is part of, just like the West's attitude to people in the colonies in days gone by. You have to demonise people and cheapen them and say that they're not worthy of the same as you are. They're part of the other rather than part of you. So for those two things.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Truman. We're going to continue to the other presentation now.
I'll be passing a box around for the money before you all forget.